So I'm going to be talking to you about the fruit of some of the research that Kyle and several of us did on the Rwanda and Kosovo cases and its application to cases today, as well as a little bit of background, a little bit of history, if you'll permit me, a historian's luxury of going back into history for just a couple of minutes. And I'm starting my timer now. So I'm giving myself 45 minutes to mostly talk rather than answer questions, but I will answer questions along the way if you wish, but it'll take time away from our discussion. I'm going to ask you questions too. You've done the reading, and it could be a legal fiction, but we're going to assume that you've all done the reading for this session. So you've read parts of our study, you've read the article from the New Yorker on disaster preparedness, and you've read also about some Marshall Plan stuff, and Syria, etc. So let me just proceed. Now, we're not only interested in genocide, as you'll see in a moment, but when it comes to genocide, intent is obviously the single most important part of Article 2 in the definition, which distinguishes the intent to destroy a group as such, and one of these groups that are listed below, races, religions, ethnicities, and nationalities, as such, in whole or in part. I'm not going to repeat Renee's lecture, which was fine. Marie, could you do me a favor? Oh, she's out. That's okay. Yeah, I mean, it would just help so I don't have to go back and forth. At least 5 seconds every time I do it. Okay, thanks. Natalie, okay, that's great. Natalie, thank you very much. Okay, so the affliction that we call genocide used to be the normal response of empires to rebellions, resistance, and all the bad stuff that they thought they had to face. Put yourself in the shoes of a conqueror for a minute, Genghis Khan and others. Genocide was part of the toolbox. And we trace genocide back to the development of the earliest human settlements and the development of agriculture, when it became profitable for migratory pastoralists to seize the harvest from people who had collected it, when they decided it was much easier to expand and acquire than it was to actually live off their cattle or live off whatever their goats and cows produced, etc. And they essentially ran a protection racket. So they would come around all the time and say, please, we'll take 10% of your crop. Oh, you're not going to give it to us? Well, then you're going to pay a price. And when these people resisted 2 or 3 times, they said, all right, we have to destroy you as an example. And Thucydides writes about how the Athenians did. The Athenian Empire was, in one facet, a vast protection racket in the Mediterranean. And when the Melians in 416 BC resisted and refused to pay tribute to Athens, the Athenians killed every single man on Milos and enslaved all of the women and children and destroyed their shrines and banned the use of the name of the people, the Melians. They ceased to exist. It was a genocide. Okay. So genocides come out of our human nature. And that part of our human nature as it has evolved, which is capable of violence, capable of aggression, capable of extreme acquisitive activities, and also are concerned for security as well sometimes. They do not simply spring up like mushrooms. They are almost inevitably planned, even if the planning is very short. That's what makes them genocides, because the intent, the mens rea, is there. And they have specific motives. So let's go ahead to the next slide. In history, Kurt Johnson and I, Kurt, a sociologist, a historian, found throughout all of human history there were 4 major motives for genocide. The first one was economic gain, and a more recent example in the Melians' destruction by the Athenians was the German army's destruction of the Herero and a good part of the Namba people in what became Namibia eventually between 1903 and 1907. The Nama and the Herero, there were something like 80,000 Herero when the struggle began in 1903, and by 1907 there were about 15,000 Herero left. And this is long before the Nazis, this is long before some of the contemporary ideologies that often proved to be genocidal. This was simply Imperial Germany doing what imperialists do, and doing it to create terror as well as to hold down future rebellions, as well as to acquire land from primarily the Herero for their cattle ranches, etc. And of course the crime of the Herero was, after a while, after their women were raped and there was no justice by German settlers, they decided to rebel. And they very carefully, by the way, did not kill German women and children. They killed German men. The Germans did not reciprocate the favor, and they went on to kill everybody. A second of the four major motives for genocide is the elimination of a real or perceived threat. And the Rwandan genocide is largely in that area, but not exclusively. And very often, these cases have more than one motive. But the important thing to recognize is these are persistent motives throughout human history. And in the eyes of, and that's what's central here, in the eyes of the perpetrator, the Tutsi exile community, the Tutsi diaspora, and the RPF and its military force, starting particularly in October 1990 when they crossed from Uganda into Rwanda, constituted a threat to Hutu hegemony or hegemony in Rwanda. And the result was that the Hutu power people seized control of the government agenda. They were already very present before the president's plane was shot down in April '94, and said, we have to eliminate all the Tutsi in order to, they said, to protect ourselves from genocide committed by the Tutsi. So they projected onto the Tutsi exactly what they intended to do. And Scott Strauss, in his book, The Order of Genocide, one of the best monographs in Rwanda, shows how that idea percolated right down to the village level. Leanne Fuji, who's now at the University of Toronto, did her work in Washington, D.C., shows also at the village level how effective this trope was in mobilizing local people. If we could be as effective in mobilizing public opinion and attitudes towards prevention of genocide as the genocidaires are in mobilizing grassroots local support to commit genocide, then we could stop this monster. Let's go on to the next slide. Shaka Zulu, in the early 19th century, decided to create a Zulu empire. And he was perfectly willing to assimilate and integrate neighboring peoples into the Zulu, particularly the women and children. But when a people like the Ndwandwe rebelled against Shaka's control 2 times and then 3 times, just like Genghis Khan, he decided these people have to go. And so he sought to totally destroy them. And it's a very important case for Africa in the early 19th century. And it's a case that we can learn a great deal from. Shaka was a very effective empire builder. And such was the fear of Shaka and his impi, his warriors in the crescent formation they used, that many African peoples in southeastern Africa today have in their oral traditions the tales of how they had to flee farther north to escape from Shaka and the imposition, not only of tribute, but then the punishments when tribute wasn't delivered, which often included the killing of all of the men. The most important single lethal motive for genocide in history has been the desire to impose a belief system, a religion, a theory, what we call an ideology. We all recognize that every one of us sitting here subscribes to some sort of belief system, and that often we're unaware of all of the consequences of that. That's one thing that postmodernism has taught us in great depth. But there are some ideals that are more toxic and lethal in their potentials than others. And the notion, the single most dangerous idea in human history, and one that I am guilty of, is the belief that we can create something like a perfect society. The pursuit of the perfect society is fraught with all sorts of genocidal potential. It goes back to monotheism, it goes back to the notion of social engineering, it goes back to the idea that if there are problems, they shouldn't exist, etc. And it takes a lot of education for people to grasp the notion that we can never really develop a perfect society, because we're human beings and we are guilty of human frailties. And with some education, we can do better than we do, but the worst thing we can do is to act in a way that says, in order to achieve a perfect society, we have to destroy this other group which stands between us and a perfect society. So demonization, othering, creating the we-us sort of situation is one of the most important steps on the road to genocide. And it comes sometimes out of our very best impulses. So the same people, like those of us sitting here, who are capable of altruistic acts and recognize the danger of genocide, etc., have to be very careful. As one of our registrants points out in an essay, the whole idea, the Western idea of human rights, has a history. And that history is not only attached to liberating people from oppression and persecution, it's also attached to colonialism and imperialism. How did the European powers again and again and again intervene in Ottoman Turkey? Proclaiming that they were there to protect Christian minorities against persecution, and all of a sudden they acquired this area, that area, and had more justifications for seizing territory. What were they doing when they were fighting the slave trade? And intervening not only on the coast of West Africa and later East Africa, but rather deep in the interior. How did Britain acquire Nigeria? Fighting the slave trade, getting right to the root of it, etc. So, the world remembers this. We're not, as you all know, we're not here alone, right? So when we speak to Africans, we speak to Asians, we speak to Latin Americans, we speak to Native people here, First Nations, Aboriginal peoples, Australia, etc., etc. We can't speak to them on Tasmania because they're gone. We can't speak to the Yuki in California because they're gone. But all these other people who survived our onslaughts, which didn't start out to be genocidal necessarily, but became such when they resisted, rebelled, and refused to conform, remember these things. And of course, what Claudia was saying about when she said, well, she said it very gently, that the idea of humanitarian intervention is a very delicate issue among the members of the UN, the General Assembly, the Security Council. Well, damn it, there's a reason for that, right? It's called history. And it's like our families, they remember not only the good things, they also remember the bad things. And that's part of our legacy. So we have a lot of baggage to deal with. Natalie, thank you. So let me remind everybody, there's a whole set of international criminal law and instruments, legal instruments, attached not particularly to genocide, but to crimes against humanity. And thanks to the evolution of the international legal framework that Renee spoke about, we can now go to some of the events that precede and processes that precede genocide, and also try to mobilize our governments to act before we get up to the level of genocide with the legal architecture that now exists. And crimes against humanity are very often the precedents in societies as they move around the cycle towards genocide. And here are some of the crimes against humanity. And you can see how, in many ways, you can think back to Rwanda, you can think back to Burundi in 1972, you can think back to the DRC, you can think back to Sudan, and you can see these crimes against humanity came before genocides emerged. Let's go to the next slide. Let's keep in mind some of what the justice ministries and departments, war crimes people, etc., call modern genocides. So, what happened in all these countries since the end of World War II, never mind what happened before, which was bad enough. And let's bring into our discussion this morning what we've learned, not just what I've learned, but what you've learned as well from those cases. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So, the risk factors that are particularly important that we need to keep in mind is the way, first of all, we identify groups and other groups. And we other them on the basis of these identity criteria listed there. We other them through public hate speech that is insightful. And one of the great things to come out of the disaster that was the genocide in Rwanda is, thanks to what RTLM did and hate propaganda on the radio, and in Kangura, a print medium that was used particularly in Rwanda, we're much more aware now that we have to monitor what is said and what is printed, and pick up the clues much earlier, and then try to get action on the clues. And that's why Juan Mendez went to West Africa and dealt with Cote d'Ivoire and dealt with hate radio and was acting on the basis of the wisdom that was acquired as a consequence. Now, could he have done it? Could we have done it in Rwanda in December 93, January 94, February 94, March 94, when RTLM was on the air and helped to prevent the genocide? It wasn't the only reason it was a genocide, it was one of them. And could we not have known from what Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, had done, and the way in which Jews were demonized under the Nazis in Germany starting in 33, and particularly in 35 when the Nuremberg decrees were brought in and hate propaganda really mounted, etc., etc. Yeah, we could. But, you know, Rwanda's in Africa, and everybody was focused on what Europeans did in that sphere. And nobody really thought that Africans would use hate propaganda. Well, you know, they're as smart as we are, why not? So they did. And indeed, some of those people using hate propaganda in Rwanda were quite aware of Joseph Goebbels' theories and the analysis of those theories that followed the fall of the Nazi state. I think you're all familiar with these actions that are part of assessing the risk factors. So let's go on to the next. This is an alternative explanation for genocide. May appeal. My daughter gave me that. And Claudia will remember, I think I used it when we were together last. I love it. I think it says a lot about some of the, we know there were women who killed in Rwanda, so I mean, it's not really strictly a gender issue. But if you can't see it because of the light, that's somebody who's obviously an NRA member who's in his hot tub with his telescope-sighted rifle. He's got his beer on the edge of the hot tub. This is a comment on aggression, and particularly male aggression, in the genocidal impulse. Let's go on to the next one. So, that's good. So, what is the difference between knowledge and wisdom? Because knowledge is not enough. We need sagacité, we need wisdom in order to act effectively. Anybody suggest what the difference is? How is knowledge different from wisdom? Colette?
Wisdom, perhaps, when you learn from your experience?
Yeah, learning from experience is certainly a very important part of it. Any other suggestions? Neil? No?
Knowledge is what you know, wisdom is what you do with it.
Acting on the basis of what you've learned. Is it Joseph? Wait, sorry. Laszlo, yeah.
Wisdom as a temporal element and more importantly, the evolution of
are all excellent. Want to press the button one more time? That's a practical definition. Right? The last thing that all of us want to do, the last mistake we want to make, if we make any mistakes, is to try to prevent genocide in ways that actually make it worse. And I'm going to say this just for myself. We are only at the beginning of our wisdom about genocide prevention. We mustn't confuse knowledge with wisdom, and we mustn't make matters worse. And you think that's not a danger? I'll give you a quick example. The people who work with Barbara Harf and Ted Gurr now have hard data which indicates, and this is not unique to their studies, hard data that suggests the most dangerous time, the highest probability that mass atrocities will be prevented is the period just before elections or a forecast international intervention. In other words, the very act of demanding democratic elections itself triggers in many societies those very important thoughts and beliefs and fears, particularly the anxieties of losing power when you have a well-established authoritarian state. We're going to lose power. We're desperate. This is our last, what Assad has done and what we've seen in other places, including Libya, etc. This is part of that syndrome. The worst thing we can do is to make hollow threats. Not only does any threat of intervention trigger more mass atrocities, remember it, threats of intervention trigger more mass atrocities, but if we then don't intervene, it's even worse. Because the people who thought we were going to intervene also act. It's not at the level of Alan Cooperman's moral hazard argument, perhaps, but they certainly do act. They are empowered and emboldened when they think that the cavalry is on the way to rescue them. So they expose themselves. They come out into the open to be ready to inherit power or to seize power. And then they're vulnerable again, and you have more mass atrocities. So we have to be very careful. Let's go forward here. Now, the Will to Intervene project is a project which seeks, first of all, to deploy quiet diplomacy and negotiation and mediation and all the peaceful options. But the Will to Intervene project is founded on the recognition, based on what happened in Rwanda and the difference in Kosovo and even later in Serbia and Croatia, that if you do not have the credible use of force as one of the options on the table, you sap the energy and the probability of success from any kind of outside participation in conflict resolution and mediation from the process. You suck the oxygen out of the system. We know this from our own experiences with our own justice systems and the way we provide security in our own societies. If we could trust every individual to do the right thing, we wouldn't need police, we wouldn't need courts, etc. We wouldn't even have disputes between people about property and contracts. But we can't. We need to have some institutional mechanisms to accommodate our frailties. So this is the laundry list, but it's an important one, of the ways in which quiet diplomacy can work. In other words, there is hope. Quiet diplomacy can be effective. And one of the best enactors of quiet diplomacy is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, in its work in the Caucasus, in its work in really difficult situations in Eastern and Southern Europe. Let's go on. A lot of this requires very, very serious confidence building. It requires really understanding the culture and the languages, the traditions, the religions, the economic geography, the physical geography of the places that you arrogantly assume you can help. The worst thing you can do is go in as an ignorant jackass and start telling people what they should be doing, using your authority as somebody who comes from a society that lacks the same conflict at the moment. Because that's a formula for disaster in itself. Let's go on to the next one. And local civil society groups are central to this process of peaceful conflict mediation and resolution. One of the areas of research that is going to be most important in the future, in my view, is developing criteria and metrics and just plain common sense about which local civil society groups, outsiders who are trying to minimize violence and maximize social justice, should collaborate with. What are the metrics? What are the actual signs of the credibility and effectiveness and good intentions and ability to handle authority of a local civil society group? Recognizing that a group that might be great today might be terrible 5 years down the road, because we all know what Lord Acton said about power corrupting, right? And we have to remember that. That didn't all disappear when the 19th century ended. Let's go on. So, very briefly, I have a couple of graphs illustrating the high cost of just letting things slide, right? And what it cost us in Britain, France, the United States, the NATO countries, etc., to intervene in the former Yugoslav states, to set up in Rwanda, for Rwanda, the ICTY, the ICTR for Rwanda, I should say, etc. And you can see that annual global military expenditures are enormous. And actually the cost of these mediating or ameliorative institutions is trivial compared to that. But that doesn't register. And we're going to talk about why that doesn't register. Because if we don't start understanding that at the very beginning, and we just rely on charts like this, we're dead. You know, that's on my list of arguments that have never worked. Saving money, say that to Bill Clinton, who wanted to save money, but not this way, not if the political risk was 1,000 times greater. No, that argument doesn't work. Okay, let's go on. Notice that the major costs that are listed near the bottom here are for the justice system that enforces international criminal justice. I regard the creation of the Yugoslav and Rwanda tribunals and all of the special tribunals as the single most important symbol of our failure. It's a symbol of our failure to work with the good local people in countries like Rwanda and the former Yugoslav states, that we had to have those tribunals. And those tribunals become the moral substitutes for early action to prevent mass atrocities through development aid that's really wisely targeted, through mediation, diplomacy, etc. And they occupy so much space. I'm a strong supporter of the tribunals, of course. But the point is, they are the icon of our failures to prevent. We would not need them. And they must never become a substitute that makes us feel good about what we've done. They are a sign that we failed. The Nuremberg trials, the first Nuremberg trials, were a major symbol of our failure, and in no way excused us for our inactions between 1933 and 45, just to mention, or 33 and 41, or 39 in Europe. Okay, let's go on. Now, I've asked you to read an essay from the New Yorker that I think actually has a lot of clues that can help us. there's a huge difference in the culture of preparedness and the culture around preparedness between the Netherlands and France on the one side and the United States and probably Canada too on the other side. And just as sociologists and anthropologists recognize that notions, ideas about gun control, ideas about religion, ideas about food, etc., are different in different countries. In our own sort of bubble of liberal democracy in Western countries, we have to recognize there are differences between us and other countries within the bubble. So look at this. Look at this. The Dutch lose 2,000 people in one great storm surge in 1953, right? This is what you read about. And they invest billions of guilders in building their defenses. The United States, again and again and again and again, suffers massively destructive hurricanes and sits on its ass. Does next to nothing. Because in the United States, the idea of prevention is submerged well below the idea of cutting taxes, keeping big government out of local state affairs, etc. And it's only after the disaster that the United States spends the money. And just as in the case of genocide prevention and mass atrocity prevention, they spend much more money than they would have to if they spent the money on prevention. So the bad news is that they have tête à béton. They're really stupid. I was born in the Bronx, and we're really stupid, okay? We are dumb. We don't get it. The Dutch get it. So that's the bad news. The good news is this means we can ally ourselves with a lot of other groups who need to engage in educating the North American publics and other societies as well about the importance of prevention, not just of mass atrocities, but of natural disaster probability and reducing that probability. And that when we build out laterally and horizontally, we have natural allies in all those vulnerable areas, which we always kind of sensed, right, about the environmental movements and climate change and all of this. But now we have links based on mutual self-interest, which I believe is the single greatest engine in human progress. Next to altruism, next to humanitarian impulses, etc. Self-interest is a hugely powerful engine. So let's go on. This is a great figure. It takes 4 times longer than in France and 7 times longer than in the Netherlands to resolve a power failure in the United States. Those are objective, solid statistics. And every U.S. taxpayer would save $3.65 for every dollar invested in prevention in the infrastructure in the United States if Congress allocated the money and it was implemented, right? But remember, this is still on a par with investing in genocide prevention. They don't get it, but they don't get this either. So we need to address, together with the other groups in these movements that address the question of disaster prevention, crimes against humanity prevention, genocide prevention, etc., and develop an impulse that works. Let's go on now. And one more. My key message, I think Kyle might agree as well, and others who work with us, is that it's crucial to do what the Obama administration has started to do under the impetus both of the Cohen-Albright report and our report to integrate the notion of genocide prevention within the notion of national security and protection of each nation's people from the indirect as well as the direct consequences, but mainly the indirect consequences of mass atrocities elsewhere. It's about security and the national interest first, and doing the right thing second. Doing the right thing is only second, because if you make it first, it doesn't work. You don't persuade the key political leaders, okay? So our leadership needs to be focused on persuading people that it is in their own interest, their self-interest, to work on mass atrocity prevention. So how are we going to do that? Let's keep going. These are all the factors you know about that are triggering the events that precede mass atrocities. It looks like an overwhelming list. You're going to stop all of those things? Well, first of all, we're all aware of them, and therefore we're aware of how tough this job is going to be. Let's go to the next slide. I'm focusing here on Canada, which happens to be very relevant right now. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. This and the slide that follows maybe is probably the most important slide I'm going to do, what I'd like to discuss with you. This is the heart of our argument. It is the beginning of our argument. It's not the argument. It needs to be refined and reinforced and expanded. But the heart of the argument, as you saw in the study that we did, in the summaries that you can read about, is this: that mass atrocities not only create expensive refugee flows and things like that. First of all, they produce concrete threats to people in North America, in Western Europe, in the richer countries, that hurt, that cost not only for refugee support and things like that, but simply for maintaining access to natural resources. In other words, where is Mrs. Sorensen? Yes. Access to natural resources are severely diminished by the disorder and chaos, both at the site of origin of the of the natural resources, the places where the coal, the oil, the minerals come from, but also the disorder that's injected into international trading networks. And of course, the icon for that disorder is the spread of piracy in the Indian Ocean, in the Gulf of Benin, the South Atlantic, in Asia, in the key straits that our petroleum is shipped through for Asian and other countries, etc. And the growing danger that as disorder grows in neglected, vulnerable countries, that piracy will become the kind of plague that it was in the 17th and 18th centuries, when commerce could only proceed under armed protection for virtually every ship that was going to succeed, and virtually every ship had to be armed in order to conduct trade. Stay there. In addition, the kinds of mass atrocities that we want to prevent spawns terrorism in several forms. Not only sanctuary for terrorism, but it also creates, where terrorist planning goes on, but even more importantly, the kind of terrorism that creates the sort of thing we saw in the Boston Marathon bombing. Very simple, individual, uncoordinated, perhaps, acts in which the resentment of people who are part of a much larger, we would call it a refugee diaspora, even though that may not always be the case. But in the case of what happened in Chechnya and Dagestan and other places, people who have in their past a latent, not an overt, but a latent potential to resort to the story of the injustices done to them by people of a different religion, from a different country, a different culture, the way that in many cases we've seen the thoughts of individual committers of bombings and shootings, etc., have been thinking. So it's really, in fact, to talk about our greatest single vulnerability. General Dallaire spoke about it in his opening talk, when he spoke about First Nations peoples, who are not the most numerous, but they're enough, and they've been trying now for over 100 years to find a place in our society, and they've been the objects of pressure to be exactly like us if they want to do that, and resisting it. And their youth are full of potential for these kinds of activities. And they have a legacy, they have a history. Their oral history and their written history and the government commission investigation histories of the residential schools in the US and in Canada, etc., give them plenty of reason to be bitter and angry and to create violent events, right? I mean, that's there. And if we ignore that, we're complete fools. There's a nice one. Okay, let's keep going. I've already mentioned terrorism. Let me go on to the danger of worldwide lethal infectious pandemics, which is the elephant in the room. Now, the probability is that when we have one of those new big pandemics, and we'll certainly have one, it will come from an animal vector the first time. But public health is all about reducing the probability that we will suffer from pandemics through prevention. And so this public health sphere is a natural ally of ours, not only because it's part of the prevention universe, and they get it, but also because we are literally at higher risk of a worldwide pandemic like the 1919 flu and things like that, resulting from mass refugee and internally displaced persons challenges. I think most of you here from the Red Cross and other organizations are aware that it's very difficult while refugees and IDPs are under attack to vaccinate, inoculate, introduce sustained treatment with antibiotics so you don't develop drug-resistant antibiotics, etc. And to do all the things we need to do to prevent epidemics. When people are in camps, it gets a little bit easier. Sometimes they get better medical treatment than they got in their villages. But potable water, sanitation, and medical treatment fall away when mass atrocities are underway. And we have an argument we have not sufficiently used that could persuade 9 out of 10 people walking by this building that they have a vested interest in preventing mass atrocities that generate huge flows of refugees and IDPs. And this is it. And we need to bring Johns Hopkins, Harvard, Cornell Weill, and all the centers, the great centers of public health and prevention into our universe and work together with them on studies that show the hard evidence that this merits attention when we start arguing for intervention in places like Rwanda. 5 years before, 3 years before, 2 years before. Because politicians will listen to that if you can show them the data. In addition, we need to go beyond the obvious public health centers of excellence, like Hopkins, etc. And we need to bring in the very specialized government agencies that work on protecting us from bacteriological warfare. And I started that here. I started this in 2009, I think, when we released our report. And I actually secured wonderful cooperation in Ottawa from an agency that works on that area, and had ready to come to our press conference when Kyle and I launched the report in Ottawa with General Dallaire and some great people. And the government intervened and blocked this bacteriological warfare protection person from coming to the press conference. It's a sensitive area. If I was a politician, I'd be worried about panicking the public. I'd be worried about revealing secrets. But I'll just share with you one thing of many that this specialist was going to tell us, and it's not a secret. It's 45 minutes. In every major city in North America, the government is not only listening or tracking the patterns of our phone calls and emails, it's also sampling the air. It's also getting daily reports from hospitals and doctors' offices about the kinds of infections that are present. And if it failed to do that, it would not be doing its job. It's also monitoring radiation levels in every major port, airport, and railroad hub, together with infections and the air and the bacteria and viruses that they can detect. And they're doing it because they recognize the high potential for societal destruction of a terrorist or a state smuggling into one of our countries an infectious disease microbe, and without announcing anything, simply releasing it into the air or in a station or wherever people concentrate. And so they have to determine, first of all, what is the level of background radiation, so that if radioactivity spikes because somebody has brought in radioactive dust and is spreading it, that would create more leukemia and more radiation disease among the people exposed to it, they would catch the spike. They could see on the Geiger counter that all of a sudden, compared to the previous week, it's now 100 times higher. And then they would know they have a problem. At the same time, they're doing that for bacteria and viruses. And that protects us. Their greatest fear is that the level of infection that circulates in the environment will become so high that they won't see the spike. They have to be able to see it, because our measuring instruments and our capacity to monitor is not infinite, right? So they have to be able to see the spike. In other words, the more we generate through sitting on our hands, the spread of mass atrocities, the increase in the refugee and IDP population, and all those conditions, including simply mass poverty and immiseration, the more likely it is that bacteriological and viral background level will go up. And so they, again, are our natural allies, and they're quite willing to tell this to the politicians and explain the technicalities so they get it. Okay, let's go on. Just to mention one last point. I believe in accepting refugees. I believe in protecting people where they live. I believe in providing everything we can to IDPs. I even have a son who at one time was a refugee lawyer, which I'm quite proud of. But I believe also that refugee diasporas in our own North American cities, which are a symbol of our altruism and our openness, at the same time can be problematic. And they're problematic because they're special interests, just like people who manufacture Swiss cheese. Okay? Their baggage includes what happened, where they came from, and why it happened, as they interpret it. So we like to use the example of what happened when the Tamil Tigers were under attack in the last stage of their death throes, you might say. In Toronto, just prior to that, in Toronto, under great pressure, the Tamil community went out, not everybody, but some, to the Gardiner Expressway, which is our equivalent to the Long Island Expressway or the Trans-Canada, and stopped everything. They brought traffic to a halt. In Ottawa, it's just a coincidence, I happened to be on Parliament Hill that day. The Tamil Tigers stopped all the public transportation on Parliament Hill and paraded by with their Tamil Tiger flags and brought everything to a halt. Could have been much more than that. So we did the right thing in accepting them as refugees, etc. But there's also a price to be kept in mind. The more situations like that emerge, the more the member of parliament who comes from that riding knows he has to focus on their interests at home and their issues, and his pressure on the government to do this or do that has to reflect his need to be reelected and to get their votes. So we bring those problems that we think, that our politicians think, they just keep off the table, are never off the table. They assert themselves vigorously when the particular groups are threatened, and they have very good reason to act and to get our attention, and sometimes that actually undermines some elements of our democracy that should not be undermined. We should be able to focus much more on developing our own society than having to accommodate the interests of any particular group in our domestic and foreign policy. Let's go to the next slide. In this country, we have a great legacy, which is now under attack and being wasted and submerged. Let's go to the next one. Those of you who have participated earlier or currently in the civil rights movements in your countries of origin, or have read the history of the civil rights movement in the United States and here in Canada, know that it was crucial to work at the grassroots level. And what Kyle and I and General Dallaire have tried to do, with the help of the Simons Foundation and others, is to organize civic dialogues in major cities across Canada that bring together representative members of 4 communities. First of all, the least obvious community, which is the business community. So in Vancouver, which has many very, very innovative companies, the Simons Foundation brought together some really good people from the business community, got them to the table for 5 hours to sit next to representative but very important politicians from British Columbia and Ottawa. So we had something like, we had the former Premier of British Columbia and then sitting member of Parliament. We had the leader of the leader of the majority party in the Vancouver City Council. We had people from the provincial legislature. We had present and former national political figures here in Canada. So there were roughly 10 politicians, 10 business people. Then we had people from religious groups and NGOs, and we had academics. So now we're talking about people who do the research and the advocacy and are in touch with conditions around the world, sitting together with people who actually have authority and have power to do things. And we also had representatives of the media sitting with us. So we were 40 people with a four-sided arrangement of the tables. And every theme that we're addressing today and tomorrow and yesterday in this conference was on the table. And we call it a civic dialogue because I was allowed to speak for 15 minutes. No monologue, dialogue, right? And we had a professional animator of discussions, and she was terrific. And the first question she asked the people around the table who had been given copies of our study, which, did everybody get one? Yeah, okay. So you know what I'm talking about. This, right? In English or in French. And we assumed they had read everything, but they had the summaries also in pamphlet form. And we said, she said, okay, you've heard Frank's 15-minute summary and heard a little bit about their motives for doing this. So, what is your greatest hope for this project? Where do you think it can be useful? What would you like to see advanced from it? And then she asked a question I never would have asked. What is your greatest fear resulting from your understanding of this project? And they got that out. It was all on the table. Right? And we had people who said, you know, we're afraid of neo-imperialism, we're afraid it'll encourage colonialism, it'll encourage arrogant Western liberal intervention that will make things worse and all that. And so, you know, I saved those. I was asked to save my responses, which was good. And then, after I was given a chance just to respond for about 5 minutes, they were asked basically to conduct a secret ballot. Do you think this project should be supported? And if you do, what are you prepared to do to advance this project personally? So first I had the secret ballot, and the idea of assisting responsibly protect principles in Canadian foreign policy and domestic policy won something like 70% of the people who were there. Not up, 70%, not bad. And that was secret. And then they were each asked to write down what, if they supported it, what they proposed to do, and that was put on the wall with stickers containing their suggestions. And one of the suggestions was that if the study was turned into a book, it would be ideal for first-year political science courses because it was the only example that the political science faculty members who were present could think of a research study relating to preventing genocide and crimes against humanity that actually came forward in the same book with concrete proposals to change public policy and specifics about how to change public policy. And so we took that suggestion to McGill Queen's University Press, and they agreed to publish this book. We reversed the order of the chapters, so instead of the recommendations at the beginning, which is what you have in the study, which is designed for public policymakers, for students, we flipped it so they come at the end. So first they read the case studies, then they read the recommendations, and they can debate them. And so that works in class. Let's go to the next slide. When we're done at the end of the civic dialogue, we also ask the municipal council or the provincial legislature or the community group to present a resolution supporting our recommendations to the Government of Canada, to let the federal government know that at the grassroots level, this issue is alive and that people care about this. And it's coming from people with clout. It's coming from people who, in the eyes of the politicians, matter just as much as the lobbyists who come to their offices daily asking for changes in legislation, contracts, etc. So, in the end, we also become advocates of lobbying. not just grassroots action. And most of us have backgrounds in which we have participated in some kind of mass mobilization, whether it's for a political candidate, or for a civil rights cause, or some other cause, or something in our religious groups, or in our cultural and social groups. So we have the tools, we know how to do it. Let's go on. This is the Vancouver resolution. It's the best one we ever got. And let's go on a little further. And this is the mayor of Vancouver with the leader of the majority who was with us at the dialogue, Jeff Miggs, who's a great guy. And he actually, I think, wrote the resolution. And General Dallaire came in for the occasion, and it was a photo op for the mayor, the city council, and some other very fine people. Let's go on. So, you have our recommendations in these 4 crucial spheres. Leadership is probably the single most important, but let's go on to them. Yeah. Only a few of these have now been implemented, and it's a struggle every day to ensure that those that have been implemented are not eliminated because of budget considerations or political considerations. It's a struggle every day to get new recommendations on that list implemented. Let's go to the next slide. We're very proud that the form that the Atrocities Prevention Board and other coordinating bodies will take in Washington is the form which we recommended. And I personally am very disappointed that the Atrocities Prevention Board has not yet really gelled. It doesn't have a permanent office. It doesn't have a really active staff in Washington. But I'm very hopeful that with continuing support from people like Samantha Power and advisors to President Obama, it will really take off in the next couple of years. Let's go on. These are all ideas that we came up with, that Cohn Albright came up with, studying what had happened, although never really quite saying so, in Rwanda, etc. Let's go on a little more. And if you don't want the next one, because I want to open up the floor. As you can see, we also discuss not only the responsibility to protect, but what we call, and Alan has accepted this idea, Alan Thompson, the responsibility to report as a very important dimension of prevention. Let's go on more. And if you don't mind the next one. This was our meeting a year or two after, actually it was the same year, but it was a meeting with parliamentarians in Ottawa. Go on again. Let's just go. You can see that, that's all fluff. Okay. So we began in 2012, 2013 to develop the notion that the window of opportunity had opened and that the momentum was developing. And I think that's persistent. We did an Angus Reid poll which showed in Canada there was enormous public support, even when people were asked about how they would react if there were casualties, should military intervention be required to save thousands of lives, for these kinds of actions. And the development of the new social media and other technologies means that today our capacity to act effectively, to coordinate with local NGOs in sites of mass atrocity prevention on the ground is much higher today than it's ever been before. Okay, I think we're coming to go on. Sorry. We want to take the project beyond the United States and Canada. The single most important country in which to do the next study is South Africa. South Africa is key to all of southern Africa, from the Democratic Republic of Congo to Cape Town, and from the South Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. It is an area that not only includes the Congo, but it includes Rwanda, Burundi, and the Great Lakes region, etc. And these are highly vulnerable states and societies. Consequently, we have developed a partnership in South Africa with a great group of academics, and we hope that with the help of some foundations, we will be able to implement that coordinated study with the South African team taking the lead, to do the interviews, to originate the recommendations to the government of South Africa, to disseminate the recommendations at the grassroots level and also at the national level. And we are providing as well our know-how about how you organize a study and accomplish it within 24 months. We actually did ours in 18 months, thanks largely to the sacrifices made by the members of the team, who accomplished nearly 100 interviews and then digested, etc., read, brought everything together and produced a readable and effective report. And in one country, South Africa, allowing a little extra time because this hasn't really been done before in South Africa, in spite of some pretty good studies by the Institute of Security Studies and others, that we will also partner with. This is a real innovation, and they're very excited about it. In fact, they've already started some of it on their own, which is great. So we're pushing on an open door, and I hope that funding will emerge so we can actually provide some resources to the South African team to accomplish the study. And this is the final slide. I have no argument against the importance of humanitarian values as part of my personal philosophical framework. I have no argument against the notion that we should be doing the right thing. But I do have a conviction based on research and looking at the facts that I want to let you discuss and maybe enhance in many ways. I do have a problem with the idea that if we approach politicians and the public as if they are part of the minority of people in our society who donate their blood during Red Cross blood drives voluntarily out of the goodness of their hearts, as many of us have done, that they will react positively. If you ask yourself, as I did in the abstract for this discussion this morning, if you ask yourself, where have we been effective in the past? Where have we prevented mass atrocities? And what could we learn from those cases? I cited the case of Cote d'Ivoire earlier, where Juan Mendez acted effectively. And I could give you another case which is parallel but not the same. It's like apples and oranges in some ways. And we often never ask ourselves the question, how did President Truman sell the Marshall Plan to the taxpayers of the United States? In other words, we all know the Marshall Plan poured a lot of money into the West European devastated countries after World War II and assisted significantly in the reconstruction of France and other war-devastated states, right? And that was the image that came out of it, though as one of the articles suggests, it wasn't entirely as it appeared on the ground later. That was the image we had. But I'm old enough to remember 1947. And I remember how the Marshall Plan was sold. And Secretary of State George Marshall President Truman and Secretary of State later Dean Acheson sold the Marshall Plan on the basis of the self-interest of Americans in reconstructing the economy of the West European states that had been devastated by World War II. And it wasn't just, it will help our business. That was there. And it was an important part of the argument that if the German economy, the French economy, the Belgian economy, the Dutch economy, the Luxembourg economy, etc., were restored to their pre-war vigor, there would be more jobs for Americans. There would be more trade. American merchants and entrepreneurs and automobile manufacturers would all benefit through either exports to those countries or direct investment in their economies. And there would be more prosperity at home. That was one set of arguments. But the argument that had most traction was the argument that if the United States did not rebuild those economies, the trade unions in Italy and in France, which were dominated by communist militants, would sweep into power as part of a government, and those countries would become satellites of the Soviet Union, and then militarily, in terms of American security, as well as commercially, the United States would be disadvantaged. And those arguments, as a 10-year-old, why was I aware of those arguments? Because I got a junior scholastic magazine distributed in class. I got comic books distributed in class. I was taken with my class to visit what was called the Freedom Train, a red, white, and blue locomotive pulling freight cars that were also red, white, and blue. Several cars were set up as a museum exhibit on all these threads. In other words, we were the objects of an information campaign that it would be fair to call a propaganda campaign that incessantly, persistently, widely, and with planning and forethought sought to persuade us so that we would think that really our lives depended, our prosperity depended on supporting the Marshall Plan. So we not only need a Marshall Plan, maybe something better than a Marshall Plan, in international economic assistance and help wherever it can be delivered positively. We also need a Marshall Plan approach in terms of explaining ourselves at the grassroots level to the peoples of our various countries and the networks we interact with, that persuades people it's not only the right thing to do, it's also the best thing to do from the point of view of our self-interest. And, you know, when I talk to business groups and military groups, especially business groups, I conclude, as I will now, by saying that Adam Smith had more than one thing right. He was really a Scottish moral philosopher. But Adam Smith said, it is not from the philanthropy of the baker or the altruism of the butcher that bread and meat are put on our tables. It is from their own desire for profit and advancement of their self-interest. If you want to deliver the goods, you need to engage the self-interest instincts of the politicians, persuade them that they can't win elections unless they do these things, that it's going to bite them, and it hasn't yet, that their party's survival depends on recognizing the importance of preventing mass atrocities. So the floor is open for discussion. Thank you very much. So we have about 15 minutes, I think, right, before we break for lunch. So what I want, it may not be what you want, and I'll listen to what you want, but what I want is to take one or two actual current cases, like the case of Myanmar and the Rohingya, and maybe the case of Syria, or the case of the conflict on the borders between North and South Sudan. Tough cases, in other and ask you what arguments that you can think of, that you think are important, might be advanced to persuade Prime Minister Harper, President Obama, and other leaders around the world who you think could be persuaded that it is in their interest or the right thing to do to ameliorate the suffering of people, not only by delivering foreign aid, but, refugee aid, and refugee camps, but also by dealing with the immediate triggers of these mass atrocities and, if possible, the roots of these atrocities. So let's forget, I'm going to get out from behind this thing. Let's try to focus more as a discussion group now. And because, Anwar, you're here, so you could help us a little bit. I asked you this question yesterday when we were being introduced to all sorts of delicious food. I asked you, what is the one big thing that we could do in the case of Rohingya? Your first answer was force the government of Burma to tell the truth about the history of Rohingya, to recognize the Rohingya as members of a long existing society in Myanmar, or in Burma. But honestly, that doesn't help very much, because the first thing that we can do, if it's really what logically would be the last thing we would do, simply because it's the hardest thing to do. So it's often not a good idea to try the hardest thing first, right? Much as it's to be desired in this case. We need a few easy things. Indeed, we need a few easy victories in this area. Because if, we have Rwanda, former Yugoslavia, Darfur, Myanmar, even before the Rohingya issue became the most important one. These are all failures. These are failures. There's no success. We have Cote d'Ivoire on the positive list. We have a Marshall Plan in some way as a parallel, not as an actual. We're not going to try to make people afraid of communism. That's not going to do the job. There's some successes that I've missed that you would like to see on the list of successes. Maybe we could learn from. Anybody got a success for us? One other success? Where did we do it right? Anybody got a success for us? Haiti's not a success. I mean, it's so easy to think of the places we messed up, right? Where they messed up. Okay, that's the poster case, isn't it? And I'm not diminishing it. The poster case, East Timor, so after how many years of butchery, famine, induced by the state, etc., did we finally achieve a measure of success? But it was a measure of success. And the Australian troops, together with very brave UN personnel. I mean, UN personnel in East Timor were very special. One of the most effective UN actors lived as an apartment just down the street, which he's not in, but he's a Montreal. He stayed behind, he protected, and he gave the leadership that prevented a total drought in East Timor. Okay? And they got the Australians to actually do it. Sierra Leone, how about Sierra Leone? British mercenary and then official team of South African mercenaries, then the British official team. And they did stop the arm-chopping bands who had free reign until they came in. There was nobody who was standing in the way. Liberia, when the market women of Monrovia got their act together and forced Taylor to pass every day with his caravan, women who were silently sitting in protest against the lawlessness, the rape, the abuse of democracy that Taylor created. It had an impact, and they ultimately, through their really intelligent actions and their solidarity, including even going to another country by bus
bringing all the market women and their allies to sit around the hotel where the negotiations about Liberia were taking place, and literally what they were really threatening was to impose famine on all the negotiators, including Taylor and the other people, unless they actually agreed to a regime change, to Taylor stepping down with elections. All right, those are success. So the last one depended almost entirely on what local Liberians did. Sierra Leone, it's outside intervention. Today, Sierra Leone is not a model of society, but it's a lot better off than it was before. So I'll stop walking around and give you some more examples. Because I'm only walking around because I'm so anxious about not having any examples from you, any suggestions from you. So you really have to help me here. Otherwise, I mean, it's good for me to exercise. Relieve my stress. What do you think? Here, for example, let's, all right. So, first of all, can we use the new social media in our own countries to build up this grassroots movement in ways that we couldn't do 10 years ago? So that the civic dialogue, I mean, what I showed you is the civic dialogue, that's a kind of old-fashioned way to do it. Maybe, we can use social media and the new technologies to build a different model that will reach far more people. I mean, Kyle and I are perfectly willing to schlep around North America as much as it takes, as often as it takes. But the real point is that we started before all this stuff emerged. So, Colette, you have a point.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yes, I think we really could. And Kyle and I were having an interesting discussion about your first experience with the Google Plus Hangout.
Yes.
And I think that would be perhaps one model to reflect on and continue working with, specifically with the idea among the writings of Manuel Castells, building the global public square as a new form of civic dialogue in mass atrocities prevention, using that type of technology. As you know, you can bring in guests to interact with you from different sites, but you also promote a dialogue in real time and then on YouTube, furthering the discussion. So I think that's one example.
So, I think our first, Marie, I don't know if you can hear me, our first Google Hangout had about how many participants? 40? That sounds, I heard 40, 45. Zach, thank you, I can see that. Yeah. So, that's a good base from which to start. And some of the sort of town meeting, town square, global village potential would be easy, really easy to realize.
I mean, that's a kind of modern-day salon, if you like.
Yeah.
And in that sense, the way to encourage the reflection, I think, is in the actual space there, then afterwards following up. A lot like you encouraged us to do in your presentation, to reflect. The knowledge creation, I think, comes in much afterwards, in what you do in response to what is archived. And I think that's how you nurture. I mean, on the one you create, and then you nurture through that type of a model, a more prolonged dialogue over time.
Leone.
I'm just going to do a little bit of a quick pitch for a project that we're working on, and that.
Why don't you stand up while you're, why don't you come up here, Leone, and use the microphone? Fine, sorry. Sure. It's, really in a few minutes, so let's use them well.
Okay, I'm more self-conscious. Sorry, I just wanted to quickly say, because I think it points on, it reflects on some of the things you were saying. We've been struggling with this challenge of how to try to raise awareness amongst the public and governments around the world to the fact that there's a commitment to the responsibility to protect, but also mass atrocity prevention more broadly. So there's kind of two things that are going to be happening over the next year within the center. The big thing is April 2014 is the 20th anniversary of the Rwandan Genocide. And we want to use that as a moment to try to start a conversation. and start a conversation not just here and in the usual places where we would expect, but to start a conversation in some of the countries that have come up in the course of this discussion, the kind of emerging powers, South Africa, Brazil, pretty much everywhere though. So one of the things that we're doing through the center is we've got a campaign to try to use that moment to put pressure on states to translate their kind of rhetorical commitments into slightly more firmer action. So it could be, for example, we've been talking about convening a global meeting of focal points, again around April 2014. We've been talking about pushing and working with states to get a General Assembly resolution on prevention of mass atrocities. But then there's a separate campaign, which is actually something that I started in an individual capacity and have a number of organizations that are kind of interested and involved. And so for anyone who here is interested, please just feel free to come talk to me. But it's essentially called 100 Days. And it basically uses the fact that the Rwandan genocide happened over 100 days to try to use that time period to really raise awareness around the world at a kind of more grassroots level about the prevention of mass atrocities and the responsibility to protect. And we've got a number of different kind of ideas and initiatives that different actors around the world are going to take forward. It's a very loose coalition of interested organizations and individuals. To give you an example, Model UN Association in South Africa is going to try to use the Rwandan genocide and the notion of upholding the responsibility to protect as their theme, which 500 schools throughout South Africa, both the elite schools and the schools in very impoverished rural areas, are going to use to debate this subject. There's going to be an essay contest in Brazil, but then there's also going to be a lot more kind of the traditional types of advocacy work that we all know. And the effort is really to try to get the message out.
So you're going to send that to everybody on this email list?
If there is an email list, I'm more than happy to share that all
Good,
with you.
thank you. Those are great ideas. Yes?
I think I want to go back to what you were saying and tie it back to the previous presentation by Claudia.
Yes.
Because we ended on this note about this, this international community, this UN, kind of point fingers to. And looking at what you're talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're kind of talking about how that the UN is essentially a group of our governments.
Yeah.
And that we need to be looking at how to engage our government so that they can perform their jobs in the UN.
Exactly.
Instead of going to the UN and saying, you're not doing your job.
Right.
Right? So,
That's exactly right, Angel.
so tell me, how am I going to do this when I go back home to the US?
And this is really going to be the test, because the actual actor at the UN is going to be Samantha Power, right? So, if you'd asked us to think of somebody who could represent the U.S., everyone would say Samantha, right? So there she is. But she can't do very much unless she gets the word from the State Department, the President, and even from Congress, really, because he's going to need the money. Will need. So, all right. So the takeoff point is persuading, as good as he is, President Obama is a political leader. He's not a minister of the church. He is not the leader of a cult. He is not the leader of an ideology, etc. He is a president who has concerns about his party and its re-electability and making sure that Hillary is the next president, right? Okay. How is he going to view the possibility of coming to Congress to get more money for targeted foreign aid, let's say? Say, to set up a contingency fund, which we badly need, that could be mobilized and drawn on when in country X, let's say it's Burundi, which is always on the verge, right? We need money in order to deliver assistance to people in rural Burundi, where most of the people live, who have been whipped up by local leaders trying to get resources from the center, from Bujumbura, out to where they live. Or in Mali, which, there was concretely, that was the key problem. Let's stay with Mali quickly, because we've got a break for lunch. The government of Mali failed to deliver the aid to the northern villages of Mali, the hospitals, the schools, that were promised in the peace agreements they had signed. With the money, they could have done it, but the money had dried up. So that fund could have been used to give them the money. That's a concrete case. We would not have had the destruction of some of the manuscripts in Timbuktu and the deaths that we had and the spread of the ideology of Al-Qaeda, etc., had it not been for the failure of the government of Mali to deliver the goods, because the goods had dried up, because people stopped paying attention. Right? So that would be an example. Now you have to get Congress on side. We're not talking about the United Nations Development Program. We're not talking, where's the money going to come from? You can't do it in Brasilia. You can't do it in New York. I can't do it when I have the pleasure of traveling to places with you to speak to local governments unless we can deliver the goods. Yes?
Yes, you were asking about missions that were
Successful? Yeah.
Successful, yeah. And I don't know if it's a little pretentious to talk about it, but though the intervention has positive and negative sides,
Let's hear it.
but I think the Brazilian mission in Hawaii is positive and successful.
In Haiti?
Yeah, in Hawaii.
I thought that's what you meant. It's okay.
And because it was the first mission after the Civil War, there
Yes.
was no genocide, but it was a civil war, and then there was another mission after great natural disaster that was there.
Yeah.
And in both missions, Brazil government helped that government to rebuild it, not alone, but to rebuild a democracy and to help the universities to, with knowledge about medicine and, I don't know, doctors and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's successful because it helps the country to go by himself after the mission. I mean, it was a rebuilding mission.
The real test of somebody like me standing up here, and whether I should be standing up here, is whether we break for lunch. Because I have colleagues who would keep going, but I'm not going to keep going. Because I want to be able to do this with credibility the next time I do it. So let's continue the discussion during lunch, and there will be other sessions where we come back to some of these issues. That's a great point. Thank you. Thank you very much.